His title will be talking on Ancestral Migration to Prince Edward Island. David is a graduate of Dalhousie University in Halifax. He pursued a career in marine biology at the Bedford Institute of Oceanography in Dartmouth. His scientific career went on to when he developed an interest in microscopy. Yeah. These big words they have here. His genealogical interest began in the early 1900s when his brother informed him about our Walker ancestry, and that they shipwrecked off the shore of Prince Edward Island. He promised to show him binders of data he collected over several years. Well, those binders were never found. By this time, David's interest in ancestry and stories had begun to develop. The first revelation was that the Walkers, in fact, did not shipwreck. The family that shipwrecked was that of James Townsend and Elizabeth Davis off the shore of Park Corner, David's fifth great-grandparents. A major project of recent times was a genealogy quilt. David provided the background information while his wife Susan did all of the real work. This quilt features migration routes of 25 of David's ancestors from England, Scotland, and Ireland to New England, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island. Several other United Empire loyalists are among them. David's genealogical interest has gone over the years with a database of 99,000 people. He also maintains a genealogy website, which is ancestraltrails.ca. And now I present David and his wife, Susan.
There we go.
So I'm going to start off this talk then describing a quilt that was quite a major effort. Took several years to reach completion, and initially it was to be a bed quilt, and it was to incorporate various images of family members, ancestors, homesteads, this sort of thing. And then we discussed the project further, and instead of having pictures on it, we decided to do migrations of ancestors from various homelands. And so this is the story of this genealogy quilt that would become a wall hanging, not a bed quilt. And that's the quilt there, which you're welcome to come up and have a look at afterwards. So the idea of doing migrations then started from the genealogical research that I've been doing and publishing on my website, ancestraltrails.ca. And an example of one of these migration maps that's on the website is this one of James Townsend. And they started off then the ship sailed from London and over to Prince Edward Island. And it was a bit of a bumpy ending. And this is just a close-up then of that migration route and landing on the north shore of Prince Edward Island. So the beginning. We started off then, how were we going to get these land masses created? So they were drawn and then projected on a screen such as this and then traced onto fabric. And so we had the British Isles, New England, and the Maritime Provinces. That was the area that was to be covered. And let the sewing begin. So I fed all of the information, all of the data to my wife Suzanne and she did all the work. But as she kept going, of course, I kept feeding more information, and there would be bits and pieces, maybe some edits. And so the first display that we had on this was at a Loyalist reunion in Wallace, Nova Scotia in 2008. And it wasn't completed until 2016 for the Loyalist conference in Summerside. So I'll just have a few slides then of some close-up images. And the title of this is They Came on Ships, Ancestral Migrations, which is also the title of the book that I'll be publishing hopefully this year. And this is the quilt that you see over there in the front. And you might ask, with all of these are 25 of my ancestral families, and you might ask, well, we've got all of these colored ribbons. How are we to tell who's who on whatever migration route? So, since you asked, Suzanne will untie the ribbons that will reveal a scroll. And so we have then these 25 ancestral families, and to the left of each of them is the color coding that matches the ribbon of their actual migration route. And this is a close-up then of that scroll, the first 5 of them. So we have Walker, Townsend, Reed, Coy, Dyer, Hull, Slocum, White, Drake, Palmer, Converse, Titus, Coy. If any of these names ring a bell to anybody, I'd like to talk to you afterwards. Coffin, Crawford, Hooper, Slocum, Corey, Braddock, Doty, Robbins, Seaman, and Cairns. So we're here, we have a close-up then of the British Isles and the various voyages that left from Ireland, Scotland, and parts of England, and coming over to New England. Some of them went directly to Prince Edward Island. A lot of them that went to New England early on, and their descendants left at the end of the American Revolution as United Empire Loyalists and came either to Halifax or what was to become St. John. It was just a military camp at that point, or to Prince Edward Island. And of course there have to be embellishments. Suzanne loves to quilt and embroider and all that sort of stuff, so we added all kinds of embellishments to the quilt. And this little sailing ship you're going to see in a few slides to come. Now the introduction of this from the conference at the Loyalist Inn in 2016, George Dalton suggested that I give the Journal Pioneer a call, that they might be interested in doing an article on this quilt. And I never actually got around to it, but it was either a day later or 2 days later I got a phone call from the Journal Pioneer saying they would be interested in having a look at this quilt and maybe doing up an article. So we met back at the Loyalist Inn after the conference, and here we are in the Journal Pioneer. And that was published on the 11th of July of 2016. And then we got a call from the Guardian. Well, they couldn't be outdone. They'd like to do an article. So we were interviewed by one of their reporters, and it appeared then later on the 24th of August. And then we got a call from CBC that they wanted to do an interview on this. So we were interviewed, and it appeared on CBC morning, what's it called? Morning, it was a radio program. I forget what the program was now.
Island Morning.
Island Morning, thank you. So of these 25 ancestors that were featured on the quilt, this talk is going to focus on 10 of them, And what they have in common is that they came to Prince Edward Island at some point in their lives. And so we have Alicia Coffin, Samuel Braddock, James Townsend, George Wallace, Charles Cannon, Thomas Cairns, Richard Robbins, Thomas Hooper, Ephraim Reed, and David Walker. And there's been a David in every generation since 1762. So we'll start off, no particular order to these, but I thought I would start with Alicia Coffin Sr., who's my 5th great-grandfather. And he married Deanna Stevens in 1630 in Devonshire, and they immigrated with the first of their 5 children, their first 5 children in 1642 to Massachusetts. And Alicia is the 2nd great-grandson of Tristram Coffin, and he was born in Nantucket. And he married Eunice Merrick in 1761 in Nantucket. And their last child was born there in 1778. Sometime after this period, I don't know what the exact date, the family of Alicia Coffin moved to Cape Sable, Nova Scotia. And he became a fisherman and a boat builder there. And a few years later, they moved to St. John, what was known as St. John's Island, now Prince Edward Island, settling along the Hillsborough River. And in 1783, they moved up to the North Shore, settling in Savage Harbor in Kings County, having purchased 200 acres that they began to farm. Alicia Coffin died in 1785 at Savage Harbor, leaving a widow and 9 children. His son was a farmer, a judge, and member of the Legislative Assembly. And his brother, Alicia Jr. and his brother Latham, began a shipbuilding business in Savage Harbor. And the first boat that they built then was the schooner Rainbow. Now, what I've done is to give you an illustration of the actual migration routes. And I'm sure that Samuel Holland would not approve of my cartographic skills, but so be it. So you'll see the ship down in the corner here. This is where it all begins from Nantucket. And off it goes. And landing at Cape Sable, where they spent a few years and then decided to move on to Savage Harbor. And this is a map then from 1810 of Savage Harbor, and you won't be able to read the names from back there, I'm sure, but all of these properties are Coffin properties. There's Benjamin, Alicia, Andrew, a few of them in here. Very crude map, but it does show that they were well entrenched in the Savage Harbor area. And then from the 1880 Meacham Atlas, you can see that there were at least 14 properties that were owned by various Coffin descendants. And they're largely in the same area around Savage Harbor, coming out here and then a few peppered elsewhere further away. So that's it for Coffin. Samuel Braddock, born in 1733, died in 1821, also a 5th great-grandfather, born in Staffordshire, England. And he immigrated with his wife and children to the island of St. John in 1773. Purchased a farm from Phillips Colbeck about 1784 or so in East Royalty. And he named the property Nan's Villa, probably after his daughter who was born on the island, the first daughter who was born on the island, and her name was Nancy Ann. And here was their journey then from London. Across the ocean, landing there. So that was 1773. That's all I know about the Braddocks. There's very, very little known, and I obviously have to keep digging. Next family then is James Townsend, also a fifth great grandfather, born in 1734, died in 1806. Born in Berkshire, where he married Elizabeth Davis in 1755. And all of their 10 children were born there. James, his wife, and 5 of their children sailed from London on 17th of August, 1775, on the brigantine Elizabeth. And the Elizabeth ran aground off the north shore of the island of St. John. And here we have a depiction of their cruise. And this one is just a little different. So it shows them going down through the English Channel and across over to the north shore. And then they had a little problem. The ship ran aground. And there were no fatalities. They were all rescued, and even with a lot of their personal items. And they eventually settled in Park Corner. And this is the area where they were located, with the where the arrow is here. Subsequently owned by Donald Montgomery. And this is from the 1880 Meacham Atlas. And the Townsend Cemetery is located about here, just on the east side of Campbell's Pond. And this little red dot down here is my clue that I have some reading. Not a big story. James Townsend was living on the east side of Campbell's Pond, came to New London in 1775 with his, why do I have New London? With his wife and 5 children. Settled at Park Corner after the name of his native place in the article that I'm reading from had Bedfordshire, but it should be Berkshire, England. Mr. Townsend was a trader. He supplied the early settlers with groceries, and he also supplied them with alcoholic beverages such as rum, whiskey, and brandy. These beverages were regarded as necessities of life in the early days. Prohibition had not even been dreamed of at that time in Prince Edward Island. And these were taken from notes from Francis Salzman several years ago. So, moving on, this is the house that, not the Townsend house, but this would be the Montgomery house that would become the Lucy Maud Montgomery Museum in Park Corner. And this photograph I took in 2005, and it's now owned by Robert's son David, who operates it as a bed and breakfast. And it was built about 1875, 1877, added to from an earlier 1850 construction. So 1850 seems to be about the earliest date that I've been able to find. The original Townsend homestead is no longer. So from this, they call it a shipwreck, but the Elizabeth just really ran aground on a sandbar. So I guess it's sort of a shipwreck. And they brought over some pretty large items, and one of them is this gorgeous bookcase with glass doors. Now, wouldn't you think coming across the ocean with something like that it would have been damaged or the glass doors broken? But I don't know where this is now. It's if it's still in the building that's now a bed and breakfast, but it was part of the.
It was there last year. Yeah.
Okay. So it was definitely part of Robert's museum collection. And also the grandfather clock. And this, the clock was featured in Lucy Maud Montgomery's book, The Story Girl. She wrote quite a bit about this clock. And there were also some smaller items. I'm assuming that the 3 items in the back are inkwells, but they're awfully fancy. Can anyone confirm that they were inkwells and not perfume containers? They look like inkwells. The one thing that I could not identify were these. They don't look particularly hollow from here, but they are. There's sort of a long rectangular opening and no stopper. Anyone know what these might have been? Robert didn't know what they were. No?
Could be the rest for the carving set. If you have your carving fork in your left hand and your carving knife in your right hand, you rested them on these on the table.
Makes sense.
Why hollow?
Well, I asked my mother. We had them in the house.
Yeah?
My mother's were made of crystal. They were not that shape.
Yeah.
But I think it was a standard British
Okay.
thing.
All right, thank you. So James Townsend owned a 500-acre plot in Park Corner. He was a trader, as I already described, supplying groceries to the early settlers. And he died in 1806. Elizabeth preceded him in 1795. And they were buried in the original Townsend cemetery that I showed you on the 1880 map. And as we speak, they are in unmarked graves in that cemetery because the original markers were removed to Getty Memorial Cemetery. And there is a story that Robert Montgomery told me several years ago, which explains why there's, he said this sort of tongue-in-cheek, but why there's a bit of friction between Montgomerys and Townsends. And the story goes that the Townsends, unnamed, or he wouldn't tell me who they were, arranged for the Montgomerys of this property to be away on a given day. And when the Townsends were sure that the Montgomerys weren't there, Townsends went in with horse and wagon, a big flat wagon, and removed the Townsend stones and took them over to Getty Memorial Cemetery. That's the story from Robert. So this is a photo then from the Public Archives in Charlottetown of the original Townsend Cemetery at Park Corner. And this one on the left would be James Townsend and Elizabeth Davis, which is here now in its location at Getty. Robert reckoned that this relocation happened sometime around 1936, 1940. The next family then would be George Wallace, a second great-grandfather, relatively new. Don't know a lot about him and his descendants. He was born 1840, somewhere in England, and by 1861 he was living up west in Ellerslie. And that same year he married Sarah Stapley Cannon in Cascompeck, and there will be a sad story about the Cannons that I'll relate, where Sarah is featured. And in 1883, George, Sarah, and 6 of their children, for reasons we don't know, moved to New Brunswick, settling in Port Elgin. And I do have to do some more research on this family, but that's what I know now. And their accurate migration started off from London, through the English Channel, across the ocean, up to the North Shore, and settling in Ellerslie about 1871. And these were the properties from the 1880 map of George Wallace, which included a shoe and joiner's shop right here. So he was obviously a carpenter as well as a shoe repairer or shoemaker. The next family then will be Charles Cannon, a 5th great-grandfather, born in 1750. And he was baptized in 1750 in St. Paul's Anglican Church, Halifax. And he married Kezia Davison in 1775. And sometime before 1822, they migrated and settled in St. Eleanor's, where he died. Precious little documentation on this family. But we will have a reconstruction of their voyage from Halifax. And settling in St. Eleanor's. So if we talk about Charles Cannon, and the saddest, very sad event, has to be the saddest event to inflict this family, was the death of 5 of their children, of Samuel Cannon, a descendant of Charles, and his wife Susanna Wallace. And these would be my 3rd great-grandparents. And I'll just read this, and then I have a longer story to read here. So on April 4th, 1857, on the Kildare Road, near Cascampec, this was taken from a newspaper article. The house of Samuel Cannon, shoemaker, was destroyed by fire. It appears that the parents left to visit relatives about a mile away, leaving the house in charge of the 2 older children, a girl of 12, Sarah, so that's Sarah Stapley Cannon, who married Wallace, and a boy of 10, George. The 4 younger children were sent to their beds, and shortly afterwards Sarah and George fell asleep in their beds, and Sarah was awakened by flames licking around her bed. So the story then from the Islander magazine, or Islander newspaper, and I quote here, "A most melancholy accident attended with loss of life occurred in the neighborhood of Cascampec on Saturday night last. The dwelling of Samuel Cannon, shoemaker, a poor man, living on the Kildare Road, was destroyed by fire together with all of his furniture, tools, and clothes of the family. It appears the parents left home a short time before the fire broke out to visit some relatives living about a mile away, leaving the house in charge of the 2 eldest children, a girl of 12 and a boy of 10, the remainder, 4 in number, being in bed. The 2 left in charge, becoming weary, retired to rest and had scarcely fallen asleep when they were awakened by the flames which were curling around their beds. The girl succeeded in effecting her escape by the door, and opening the window, endeavored to assist her brother out, but becoming confused with smoke and flames, he sank to the floor, and with the other 4 children was consumed with the building. The girl, though badly burned and in a state of nudity, succeeded in reaching a neighbor's house on foot, where she now lives, and little hopes are held of her recovery from the effects of fire and exposure. A spectator describes the scene as heartrending when the parents reached the burning ruins and learned the calamity that had befallen them. The mother could scarcely be restrained from rushing into the flames in search of her offspring, and it required the strong arms of 2 men to prevent her. The remains of the children were found the following day, literally burned to cinders. The parents of this calamity are reduced to great poverty, and charitably disposed persons in Charlottetown as well as in the neighborhood will, it is hoped, contribute something for their relief." And then it goes on about where contributions can be sent. Following the deaths of 5 of their 6 children, when the farmhouse burned to the ground, Samuel and Hannah, Susanna, left to settle in Biddeford. I have some happier stories. And this is the sad little tombstone for these 5 children in the Old Dock Cemetery in Alberton. And it kind of hits you when you see them. All these names, George, Fanny, John, the twins, Joseph and Samuel, and then seeing how old they were. 10 years and some months, 6 years and some months, 4 years and some months, and 1 year and 7 months for the twins. So as this article said, after the fire, Samuel and Susanna left with Sarah, the only surviving child, to live in Biddeford. And Samuel died in 1902, Susanna the year before, and both of them are buried in the United Methodist Cemetery in Biddeford. Sarah Stapley Cannon, the survivor, married George Wallace and raised a family of 14 children, 11 of whom were born on the island. And I had mentioned earlier on the Wallace outline that they had moved to Port Elgin, where their last 3 children were born. Sarah died in 1928, George in 1912, and they're both buried in Fernwood Cemetery in Port Elgin. Their daughter Susanna Wallace married first to Joseph Frank Townsend, a descendant of the Townsends of Park Corner. And that's my paternal grandmother's line. And one of the descendants featured in the Meacham Atlas is Thomas Compton Cannon, 1836 to 1887. And he was the grandson of Charles, and he was a dealer in flour, meal, and oysters in St. Eleanor's. And in this 1880 map from the Meacham Atlas, you have St. Eleanor's and the location at the crossroads of the Cannon oyster business. The next then is Thomas Cairns, third great-grandfather. And I have very little that I know about this family, so more digging needs to be done. And his timeline, he was born in 1783 in Dumfriesshire, Scotland. Sometime married Agnes Wilson, 9 children, all born in Scotland. And in 1833, they emigrated. And by 1843, we know that they were living in Bedeck. 1863, died in Summerside and buried in North Bedeck. Elizabeth, the daughter of Thomas and Agnes, the oldest ones that I have, married Robert Walker, my second great-grandparents. And here we have their cruise from Annan and across the ocean. And they would have landed somewhere there and eventually settling in Bedeck. And now we have Richard Robbins. I have my red dot, but that shouldn't be there quite yet. Richard was a United Empire loyalist from Amboy, New Jersey. Don't know when he was born. He owned a farm outside of Amboy, and he immigrated to Lower Bedeck, Lot 26, in 1783. And the following year, Richard sent for his son John and daughter Isabel. And here comes the red dot. His life ended tragically in February 1784 at Seacow Head, having died of exposure during a return trip from Charlottetown. So here's the story. And this was from a sketchbook, comprising historical incidents, traditional tales, and translations by John McKinnon, published in 1915. And so the story goes, sometime in February 1784, Richard Robbins, 2 Bs, and his 3 children set out for Charlottetown in quest of supplies. There being no roads, they had to follow the ice on Northumberland Strait, the distance being perhaps 50 miles. And on the homeward journey, a wild snowstorm came up, which, after continuing a considerable time, changed to frozen rain. Imagine how fun that would have been. Giving everything exposed to hard shell of ice. Hour after hour they continued the wearisome march, the ice cutting their footgear from first doubtless poor, not sure what that is, between cold, hunger, and fatigue. Their sufferings were truly excessive, a case where human endurance was tried to the utmost. About as much dead as alive, they at length reached Seacow Head, only a few miles from their dwellings. The bank was about a dozen feet high, and in their exhausted condition, the ascent tried them severely. Robbins, a large, heavy man, was unable to climb, and his companions, however desirous, were unable to lend him assistance. So he crawled into a cave in the bank until someone should come to his rescue. The conditions were altogether unfortunate. It took his comrades a long time to get home. The only horse in the district was several miles off, and when a rescuing party arrived, poor Robbins was dead. He doubtless fell asleep on entering the cave and so crossed the dark valley in a state of unconsciousness. This was the sad account received by his daughter when she came with further details which have since passed down from memory. The incident is calculated to show the terrible hardships endured by early pioneers who felled the first tree, built the first humble home, and raised a smoke on its hearth. They were the true heroes whose names should be honored and to whose memory lofty shafts should be raised. So this John Robbins, son of Richard, married Mary Hooper. And there's my Hooper connection. John died in 1797 in Cape Travers. Mary died in 1816 in Lower Bedeck. And here is their trip then from Amboy, New Jersey. And landing there. So Richard Robbins, here we have a map from the 1880 Meacham Atlas showing the area of Bedeck and Central Bedeck and Lower Bedeck. Sea Cow Head is right here. And a close-up view shows some of the properties owned by, or that would be the original location approximate of Richard Robbins, which today is owned by descendants of the Hoopers. And over in Central Bedeck there's a Loyalist monument and a plaque, and one of the refugees shown there is Richard Robbins. And now Thomas Hooper, Esquire, fifth great-grandfather, born in 1734 in Windsor, New Jersey. And his wife and 7 children migrated to St. John's Island as United Empire Loyalists, settling in Bedeck in 1785. Died in 1816, buried in the Bedeck Cemetery in Lower Bedeck with several family members. And his trip from New Jersey, pretty much the same route. And here we have the Meacham Atlas again. And property location then of Thomas Hooper was down here. The original Robbins property was up here. And in 1880, you can see by the red dots several properties owned by descendants of Thomas Hooper. So they're well scattered throughout the area. And on that same Loyalist plaque, you'll see Thomas Hooper's name. Eliphalet Reed, fifth great-grandfather. He was born 1730 in Massachusetts. His sixth great-grandson, he was the sixth great-grandson of William Reed, born 1446, more or less, in Kent. And in 1757, Eliphalet married Sarah Buckland. And sometime before 1759, they moved to New Brunswick. In 1759, he was with General Wolfe at the taking of Quebec City. And in 1770, he was living in Sackville, then part of Nova Scotia, in the 1770 census. In 1804, he died in Sackville. His grandson, Ephraim Reed, born in Baie Verte, New Brunswick, 1812, and sometime before 1833, he moved to what became Reed's Corner, east of Summerside. 1833, Ephraim married Rosara Chappell. He was a farmer and a tanner, and he owned 1,000 acres at Reed's Corner, extending down to what is now Cool Breeze Farms. And the original homestead was located in where the present-day Prestige Kitchen store is. And between 1834 and 1857, they had 11 children, all born at Reed's Corner. 1865, he died while traveling to British Guiana of yellow fever, and he was buried there. His descendant, Alan Reed, still lives at Reed's Corner on a much smaller property. And their journey then from Baie Verte. Relatively short trip. And this is the area, this again is the 1880 Meacham Atlas, and this is the area that I suspect was the 1,000 acres, except for Wilmot Creek. So this property up here, which is, well, this is the road coming out of Summerside, and then this is the one heading up to what is now the roundabout, Highway 2, and then going over to Travelers Rest. And this property of Charles Reed is the one that's presently owned by Alan. And then David Reed was across the road. And if you add up, Cool Breeze Farms will be down here, the Blue Shank Road is right here. And if you add up the acreages of all of these farms, they come to a few acres short of 1,000. So I suspect that is probably where this 1,000 acres was, that the original Reed farm was. Now we come to the last story. David Walker, my third great grandfather. In 1762, he was born in Dumfriesshire, don't know where exactly. 1783, he married Margaret Hetherington in Annan. And between 1784 and 1811, they had 13 children, all born over there. And 1819 is my best guess as to when they migrated, and it might have been just David who came over. And then sometime later went back to fetch the wife and kids. And so he settled in what would become New Annan. And between 1820 and 1835, he was an innkeeper. He had other titles, but basically an innkeeper in New Annan. And Margaret Hetherington died early in 1825, and he remarried because he still had some fairly young children. So he needed a woman in the house to take care of them. So his second marriage then was to Anne Bramble, daughter of Sarah. And in 1844, David died in New Annan at the inn, and he was buried about 3 days later in North Bedeck. And so we have their trip down from Annan and across the ocean. And the best guess is they went into Malpeque Harbor and then found their way to what would become New Annan. And David is the only known child, known to me, of John Walker and Sarah Hill of Dumfriesshire. And the youngest would be Robert, my second great grandfather. He was only 8 when they immigrated. 3 of their children married in Scotland before coming over. And second generation Walker folk married spouses with surnames of Glover, Marchbank, Mackay, Weir, McLean, Jameson, Hogg, and Cairns. And descendants of these original ancestors then lived in New Annan, Travelers Rest, Kensington, Malpeque. And there are some Walkers buried across the way in the Malpeque Cemetery. This is the Walker Inn in New Annan, or what would become the Walker Inn. And I took this photograph in 2005. And out back was the coach house, and this would house then the horses and the drivers. And this photograph was done in 2001, and so typically this inn would serve travelers between St. Eleanor's and Charlottetown. And they would come out from St. Eleanor's in very fancy clothes and very nice carriage and pretty horses, and they would get as far as New Annan. stay there the night, and then the next morning they'd get into their rougher clothes, get into a much larger carriage, big horses, and head off to Charlottetown and then do just the reverse there. So the earliest known record that I have for David Walker Sr. in New Annan appeared in the PEI Gazette, published on the 21st of October, 1820, and he was on a list of licensed retailers. And over the next several years, his title can be found as a licensed retailer, licensed to sell spirituous liquors. By 1831, he was listed as a tavern owner and an innkeeper. This license continued to be renewed annually, usually in the fall, until 1835, after which his son David Jr. assumed the role of tavern owner until 1844. And I've already told you about this. And this is an aerial photo. I'm guessing by the car, maybe somebody out there with automobile history knowledge can tell me. This car that's, now mind you, that doesn't mean that it's new, but I'm assuming this photo dates to the 1940s. So this was the inn, or what was the inn at that point, the coach house where the horses and the drivers were housed. And like so many people here, they were also into fox ranching, fox farming at that point. So from the 1880 Meacham Atlas, the road between Summerside and Kensington, which goes along here, we have the owner of this property then would be David's son Robert, my second great-grandfather. So this was the original 100 acres that David Walker and Margaret Hetherington had when they came out about 1820 or 1818, 1819, something like that. Now I'm assuming, because the earliest record I have of David having these licenses was in the fall of 1820, so I'm assuming he came out the year before, built a log cabin to get started, and then presumably had help to build what became the inn. And that doesn't get done on the same year. And then just down the road towards Summerside and across the road, Robert's brother John built a house, and that's the original location right there. And next door to that was the house of James Marchbank, right here, and Mary Walker. And Mary would be a sister of John and Robert. So here we have the Walker Inn again. And this is the homestead of John Walker that I showed you on the Meacham Atlas. I don't know the date of this photograph. It's in a state of damage here, and one day I need to do some repair. My wife loves to do photo editing, and you'll see an example of her handiwork here. So a bit of a diversion. So this is the original, or what is now a remodeled original house of this. So this is the original John Walker house, and this is as it appears today, or 2007. And it's lived in by Peter Walker, son of David, of Traveller's Rest just next door. Now, Suzanne looked at this photo and thought it needs some cleaning up. And so the first thing she did was to remove the overhead wires and get the car out of there. Amazing what you can do with a computer. No, that's right here. And then she didn't like the look of the garbage cans, so she took those out. Fence needed painting, so she painted the fence and added a few more clouds. And grass needed cutting, so she did that, and she repaved the driveway.
It's on the, where's the house is at?
Where's the house? The house is in Travelers Rest. It used to be New Annan, but then there was a school boundary issue. I don't remember when that was. But it's on the road between Summerside and Kensington. It's right at, do you know where Waterview Road is?
Yes.
Okay, and you know where the Wilmot Valley Road is? Okay, the Walker Inn is right at the corner of what is now Highway 2 and the Wilmot Valley Road. And then just a stone's throw towards Summerside on the other side is this house.
Where the grumpy old man used to be.
Yeah, where the grumpy old man used to be.
Yeah.
The building.
The building called the grumpy old
Yes,
man.
yeah.
It was a bookstore.
Yeah.
Oh,
They
yeah.
took it down. Yeah, that's right.
So this photo, which I took just yesterday, is the homestead of James Marchbank and Mary Walker, which is next door to the farm that John Walker had with Jane Weir. Now, gets interesting. I had a story here about Ephraim Reed. Oh, I should read you this. It has to do with the 1,000 acres. And Ephraim Reed was testifying that he was the owner of 1,000 acres at what is now Reed's Corner. And when asked the value of uncultivated land, he replied, quote, "Wilderness land is like self-righteousness. The more of it a man has, the worse off he is." So, this guy, Thomas Carroll Walker, he'd be a great-grand-uncle. Quite a character. He was born in 1849 in New Annan at the Walker Inn, son of Robert Walker and Elizabeth Cairns, my second great-grandparents. And in 1869, he moved to New Mexico, and then later in that same year to Nathrop, Colorado. And in 1880, he married Mara Martha Hawkins, and they raised a family of 7 children. In 1885, he was a cattle rancher. In 1900, he was a miner. And 1900, later, obviously after the census, he died at the tender age of 51. Now, does Thomas Carroll Walker seem like an ordinary family man from Prince Edward Island? He was anything but ordinary. So what you saw earlier was a cropped version of this photo that I took up here. And this is Tom and Jerry. Jerry was his pet mountain lion, taken about 1896, when Tom was deputy sheriff / town marshal for Leadville, Colorado. So would you think this guy came from PEI? It gets better. So from the Herald Democrat, Leadville, Colorado, September 17th, 1900, an article in the newspaper, "Many Notches on His Gun," was the career of the late Tom Walker as related by himself. And he called it "Highlights from He Had Narrow Escapes." So it's, I did cut out a fair bit from the newspaper article, but it really is worth reading, and I think we have time, sure we do. So with the passing away the other day of Thomas C. Walker, the career of a turbulent life was brought to a close, and another of the pioneers joined the silent majority. Walker was a man of strong likes and dislikes, and for a friend nothing was too good. With an enemy the feeling was reversed, and there was no such thing in Tom's makeup as forgiveness. He was absolutely without fear. The word was not in his dictionary. And this trait in his character led him into many scrapes and cost him all the money that he ever made. Born in Prince Edward Island of Scotch parents 50 years ago, and when at the age of 19, a broad-shouldered, strapping youth, he found his way to New Mexico in 1869, and a few months later arrived in Colorado and settled in Chaffee County. and this county at that time was a hotbed of cattle rustlers and horse thieves, and honest men had a hard time to get along, and justice was an outlaw. During the session of court, Judge Dyer, the presiding justice, was brutally murdered by a gang who considered that the judge was against them. This was the element that Walker found himself associated with, and being possessed of all of the grit that is desirable in a man, although young, he was soon recognized as one of the nerviest men in the county, and one perfectly able and willing to cope with the rustlers, horse thieves, and desperados that infested the county. Tom, after being in the county for a few months, saw the opportunities for making money by engaging in the cattle business and took up a ranch, and at once started to improve it. By degrees, he accumulated some cattle, and in a few years was fairly on the road to success. On all occasions, he protected himself from the raids of rustlers and was never afraid to use his gun to enforce his rights. It gradually dawned upon the cattle thieves that they were against a man who did not fear them, and one who would protect his rights to the last. So they considered that the best policy was to leave his cattle severely alone. During the early 70s, the sheriff of the county found that it was next to impossible with the men under his control to down the rustlers. And when he learned that Walker was not afraid of the gang, he called upon them and asked if he would join the sheriff's force to arrest and break up the gang. Walker said that he would, and was at once appointed deputy sheriff. Leaving a man in charge of his rents, he went to Buena Vista, where he made headquarters. One afternoon, while sitting in the sheriff's office, a ranchman entered and stated that early that morning, thieves had run off 37 of his horses, and he wanted the sheriff to recover them. Receiving information from the man as to the direction taken by the thieves, Walker saddled his horse and started in pursuit alone. After riding for several hours, he caught up with two of the gang, driving several horses at a place called Gold Dust. Walker at once ordered them to throw up their hands and to consider themselves under arrest. And to this request, they both opened fire. One of the bullets plowing through Tom's hat and the other going wild before Walker pulled his gun for action. Another shot from the thieves struck the horn of his saddle, and Walker then fired, and one of the robbers fell from his saddle. The remaining bandit again fired, this time hitting the skirt of Walker's saddle, and when he returned the compliment by laying him low. Getting off from his horse, Tom approached the dead thieves and found one was shot through the heart, and the other that the bullet had lodged in the brain. He noticed that one was of slender build and with small feet and hands, and concluded that he was a boy. Looking closer, the features appeared to be those of a woman. So I'm just reading this, it was published. So unbuttoning the buckskin shirt worn by the thief, he found that his conjectures were correct. It was a woman. She was dressed in men's clothing, and it was from her gun that the two bullets came so close to cutting off Walker's earthly career. Rounding up the horses, he returned to Buena Vista, notified his chief of what he had done, and returned with help and buried the victims. He was not tried, as the killing was justifiably done in the discharge of his duty, and this was the beginning of the end of cattle and horse stealing in Chaffee County. An island boy. And Walker gave these above facts to a representative of the Herald Democrat several years earlier with the request that they be published, quote, when he had crossed the range, remarking at the same time, quote, I've been accused of doing a whole lot of things that I've never had a hand in, but I solemnly assure you that I've never killed a man unless in self-defense. Quite a guy. And there's Tom and Jerry. So the last thing I'm going to do very quickly is to go through some tables of how these 10 ancestral families who migrated to PEI and how they married into various other surnames on the island. So we have descendants of Coffin, Alicia Coffin marrying McKee, Sanderson, McEwen, Morrow, Robbins. Descendants of Samuel Braddock marrying Clark, Saunderson, Hyde, Hooper. Descendants of James Townsend, marrying Campbell, Waugh, Penman, Cousins, Reed, Montgomery, McNeil, Green, and Silliker. Descendants of George Wallace, marrying Wright, England, Townsend, and Pickering. Descendants of Charles Cannon, marrying Rayner, Wood, Campbell, Wallace, Glover, and Ramsey. Descendants of Thomas Cairns, marrying Walker, Skierman, Darby, Glover, Cannon, Lafergie, and Jameson. And descendants of Richard Robbins, marrying Hooper, Cole, Wright, Craig, Bierstow, Montgomery, McCallum. And descendants of Thomas Hooper, marrying Robbins, Urquhart, Montgomery, this is the longest list, Cole, Crosby, Wright, Bierstow, Clark, Green, Craig, Townsend, Skierman, and Cousins. And descendants of Ephraim Reed, marrying Fergie, Laird, Carruthers, Wyatt, Clark, McLean, Yo, Hilson, and Rayner. Excuse me. And finally, descendants of David Walker, marrying Cairns, Skierman, Weir, Glover, Marchbank, Hogg, McLean, McKay, Townsend, Green, Hooper, Wiggins, Ramsey, Tanton, and Dalzell. And that's all I have to say. And for those who have computers and access to the